So if you go stand on the corner of Pok Fu Lam Road today, overlooking the southwest side of Hong Kong Island, you basically just see this quintessential wealthy residential district.
Right, very upscale.
Yeah, exactly. You've got, the expensive apartments, the really quiet cafes, all the manicured trees. It completely projects this aura of just unremarkable tranquility.
It really does. But if you were standing on that exact same spot 150 years ago, your reality would be drastically different.
Completely.
You'd have this highly statistical probability of dying from cholera or catching tuberculosis from tainted food, or, depending on who you bumped into, maybe stumbling into a covert meeting of Chinese revolutionaries.
Which is such a wild spatial paradox. I mean, we look at that modern facade today and just assume the history of the area is as domestic as its present, right?
Yeah, we tend to do that with cities. But the research we're examining today paints Pok Fu Lam as the absolute definition of a historical archaeological landscape. I mean, it was a brutal testing ground.
And really, that's our mission for this deep dive. We're taking this fascinating historical report on the district and filtering out all the academic noise to find the real story.
Because the history hiding under the pavement is incredible.
Exactly. Because if you're listening to this, you want those aha moments.
Yeah.
We're going to uncover some bizarre historical stories, point out literal hidden gems you can actually go visit as a tourist today, and then look at what physical spaces absorb over time.
It's a great roadmap.
Okay, let's unpack this. We usually think of a city's growth in terms of, commerce or politics, but the foundation of this district wasn't about wealth at all. It was strictly about biological survival.
Yeah, which is the foundational hurdle for any early settlement. The mid-19th century Hong Kong was, well, it was particularly unforgiving. It was widely known at the time as the white man's grave.
Oof, that is a rough nickname.
It was earned, to be honest. The subtropical climate, combined with virtually non-existent sanitation and just rampant epidemics, meant the mortality rate for new arrivals was staggering. And the absolute bottleneck for public health in the 1850s was just getting clean water.
Which makes total sense. I mean, if you have thousands of people relying on shallow private wells or pulling water directly from mountain streams, you're just begging for a cholera outbreak.
Exactly.
Not to mention the fire hazard, in a densely packed wooden settlement.
Right, so the colonial government was desperate. They were desperate enough to offer a $1,000 reward in 1859 for literally anyone who could engineer a reliable water supply.
Wow, a bounty for plumbing.
Pretty much. And that initiative leads us to 1863, and a civil servant named S.B. Rawling. He went out, surveyed the Pok Fu Lam Valley, and proposed a dam that would create a 30-million-gallon reservoir.
30 million gallons? I mean, for the 1860s, that actually sounds like a genuinely forward-thinking, future-proof piece of infrastructure.
Would have been. But then we encounter the infamous reality of the colonial bureaucracy.
Of course.
The officials in charge reviewed Rawlings' proposal, completely balked at the upfront cost, and systematically gutted the project. They slashed the planned capacity from 30 million gallons down to a mere 2 million gallons.
Oh my gosh. Wait, purely to save money?
Purely to save a fraction of the budget, yes.
I mean, I can't say I'm surprised. That is the classic colonial playbook, right? Squeezing pennies on infrastructure and ignoring the long-term reality. Let me guess, the 2 million gallons wasn't nearly enough.
It was an immediate disaster. Within months of it being completed, there was this massive influx of immigrants fleeing unrest on the mainland, and they flooded into the city.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so that budget-cut reservoir was drained almost instantly. The water shortage became so severe they had to implement intense rationing, and the government ended up spending the next decade scrambling to build these really expensive piecemeal expansions.
It's exactly like a tech startup cheaping out on their server capacity for a global launch to save a few bucks, only to have the entire site crash on day one.
That is a perfect analogy.
Right. And then they end up spending 10 times the money on emergency IT fixes than they would have if they just paid for the good servers in the first place.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. The short-term savings just created a massive long-term crisis. And this desperate scramble to keep the population alive didn't end with water either.
Right. Because water is just step one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Once they started managing the cholera risk, they hit the next major public health wall, which was nutrition and safe protein. And that brings us to 1886 and Dr. Patrick Manson.
The father of tropical medicine.
That's the one.
Manson is such a fascinating figure because he's operating right at the dawn of germ theory. Like, he was already famous for his parasitology work, proving that mosquitoes transmit disease, right?
Right, he was looking at the actual data.
So he wasn't just guessing. And he realized that the staggering infant mortality and tuberculosis rates in Hong Kong were directly tied to contaminated, poor-quality milk.
Yeah, Manson recognized that medicine alone couldn't fix a nutritional void. You need safe calories. So he launched this radical public health intervention masquerading as a business, which was the dairy farm company.
Okay, I love that. A health intervention as a business.
Yeah, his goal was to provide a sanitary, affordable, and high-quality protein source to patients and children. So to do this, he literally imported a herd of 80 cold-weather Scottish cows directly into the humid subtropical hills of Pok Fu Lam.
Okay, wait, I have to push back on that. Because from a purely biological standpoint, that sounds like a terrible idea.
It was definitely risky.
Like taking an animal bred for the freezing Scottish Highlands and dropping it into the sweltering, tick-infested hills of an Asian subtropic. How did they not all immediately die?
Well, honestly, many of them did at first.
Oh! Well, that makes sense.
Yeah, the early years of the farm were plagued by massive die-offs from tick-borne fevers and tropical diseases. The cows just simply weren't adapted to the environment at all.
So what did they do? Just keep shipping in more cows?
No. Manson and his team treated the farm like a clinical laboratory. They realized they couldn't change the climate, so they had to heavily engineer the microenvironment around the cows.
Oh, wow.
Over the decades, they eventually expanded to 120 hectares and 1,500 cows, but they did it entirely through highly specialized architectural interventions.
So it wasn't really just a farm, it was like a biological life support system.
Exactly.
And for anyone visiting the area today, you can actually see the remnants of this survival era hiding in plain sight.
Oh, absolutely.
Like if you hike around the Pok Fu Lam Reservoir, you'll cross these 4 beautifully carved granite bridges from the 1860s. They are pristine examples of Victorian civil engineering, completely intact, just sitting out in the woods.
Yeah, it's wild to just stumble across them. And the architectural adaptations for the dairy farm are even more striking.
Right.
If you visit the revitalized Pok Fu Lam farm, which is where the former senior staff quarters were, look closely at the building itself. It's a grade-I historical structure now. You'll notice these distinct bullseye windows near the ground level.
The round ones, right.
Yeah, and those aren't there for aesthetics. They actually utilize a basic principle of fluid dynamics to create a pressure differential.
Yeah.
It basically constantly draws hot, damp air out from under the floorboards to fight the tropical rot.
That is so smart. And if you wander into the brush nearby, you can find the actual ruins of the cattle sheds. But they aren't like rectangular barns. They are octagonal.
Yes.
Because if you build a square barn, the air stalls in the 90-degree corners, right? Stagnant air breeds bacteria and disease. But an octagon allows the wind to sweep through in a 360-degree cross breeze, constantly flushing out the pathogens.
It's pure functional design.
You can even find the original 1920s concrete dung pits out there in the woods.
Which is a very specific kind of tourist attraction, but yes.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating here is how these surviving structures prove that Pokfulam was this landscape of experimentation.
Yeah.
But here's the critical pivot. Once you solve the water crisis and you stabilize the food supply, you eliminate the immediate threat of death. And when a beautiful, coastal, mountainous region suddenly becomes survivable.
It immediately catches the eye of people whose primary concern isn't survival, but capital.
Exactly.
Right, because once you aren't dying of thirst, you can start focusing on building an empire, which shifts Pok Fu Lam from a survival frontier into a major node for global trade. Let's talk about Douglas Lautrec.
Yes, Douglas Lautrec.
In 1861, he builds this massive neo-Gothic mansion called Douglas Castle, high up on a hill. But Lautrec wasn't born into shipping money. He actually started out as a watchmaker.
And that background in horology is the key to understanding his entire spatial strategy. In the mid-19th century, before instant communication, mastering global maritime trade wasn't just about owning the most ships.
Right.
It was about mastering time. Lautrec arrived in Hong Kong and started out fixing marine chronometers, those hyper-precise clocks that ship captains used to calculate longitude.
Oh, that makes sense.
From there, he expanded into shipyards and eventually his own massive shipping fleet. He was even one of the founding players in what we now know as HSBC.
Wow. So he takes all this wealth and builds a literal castle. But knowing his obsession with precision, I'm assuming he didn't just pick a hill because it had a nice breeze?
Far from it. The castle was engineered as a physical tool for his enterprise. He intentionally chose a vantage point that overlooked the Lama Channel.
Okay.
In those days, that channel was the absolute strategic choke point for any vessel entering or leaving the main port. And at the very top of this castle, he constructed an octagonal bedroom.
Another octagon. But this time, it's not for airflow.
No, this time it's for line of sight. From that room, Laubrec had an unobstructed panoramic view of the channel. He would sit up there with his watchmaker's precision and literally clock his massive fleets as they arrived and departed.
That's incredible.
Douglas Castle was essentially the control tower for a global trade network, just disguised as a luxury home.
But then the narrative takes a massive left turn. Because in 1894, the bubonic plague hits Hong Kong. It's an absolute catastrophe.
Terrible.
The wealthy elites, terrified of the outbreak, completely abandon the area. Lauprec's family puts the capitalist fortress up for sale, and the buyer is the Paris Foreign Mission Society, the MEP.
Which represents one of the most abrupt spatial transitions imaginable.
Yeah.
The MEP had no interest in timing cargo ships. They were seeking a secure regional headquarters for their sprawling Catholic missionary network across Asia. So they purchased this monument to ruthless maritime capitalism and converted it into a sprawling religious and academic complex.
Wait, here's where it gets really interesting. They went from a ruthless tycoon counting cargo ships to monks printing Sanskrit.
Essentially, yes. They established the Nazareth Press right there in the castle.
That is a wild spatial pivot. That's like buying a frenzied Wall Street trading floor and turning it into a silent meditation retreat overnight.
It really is. And printing press doesn't quite capture the scale of what they were doing. This was a massive language factory. The logistics of the Nazareth Press are astounding.
How big are we talking?
At its peak, this operation was churning out 70,000 pages a single day.
70,000.
And we're talking about the late 1800s.
Which is mind-boggling. If you've ever watched someone operate an antique letterpress, hand-setting a single page in English takes incredible patience. But the MEP wasn't just printing in French or English.
No, they were printing in 28 distinct languages. They were doing highly complex typography in Sanskrit, Latin, and Vietnamese Nom.
Wow.
To pull this off, they couldn't just rely on a few French monks. They had to train a massive local workforce drawn from the nearby Chinese Catholic villages.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, these local workers were taught the highly technical skill of European typesetting across dozens of alphabets they didn't even speak. It created an entirely new microeconomy in Pok Fu Lam.
And right next door, they built the Bethany Sanatorium, which treated something like 6,000 sick missionaries who were traveling the trade routes all across East Asia. The scale is just incredible.
It really is.
First, the district connects Hong Kong to London through shipping. Then, it pivots and connects Hong Kong to Vietnam, Tibet, and Japan through faith and typography.
It perfectly illustrates how infrastructure absorbs the priorities of whoever holds the deed. And just like the dairy farm, the physical evidence of this era is still there for you to explore.
Yeah, Douglas Castle still stands today.
It does. It's now called University Hall, and it functions as a dormitory for the University of Hong Kong.
Which is so cool. If you go to that dorm, you have to look for the 4 unlike statue at the main entrance. It's this bizarre mythical beast that Lauprec originally installed.
It's very strange looking.
It looks like someone tried to describe an elephant, a lion, and a unicorn over the phone to a sculptor. And the university students today have built all these intense superstitions around it regarding their final exams.
Yet, touching it is supposed to be bad luck for your grades, right?
Yeah.
And consider the adaptive reuse of the interior spaces, too.
Oh, hey.
If you walk into the current student common rooms inside that dorm, you are actually standing inside Douglas Lauprec's original heavily fortified wine cellars.
No way.
Yeah, that's where he stored his expensive vintages and sensitive trade documents. Now it's just where students hang out.
It's just layers upon layers. Oh, and you can also visit Bethany. It's been transformed into an academy for film and television, and it features this stunning neo-Gothic chapel.
It's beautiful.
But the best part of that story, when the MEP finally closed the site in 1974, the chapel's original gorgeous stained glass windows completely vanished, just lost to history.
So sad.
But then, in the 1980s, someone randomly opened a crate in a government warehouse and found them sitting there intact. They've been reinstalled, so you can go admire them right now.
It's a rare victory for historical preservation, honestly. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, we start to see a pattern.
Okay, lay it out.
We have the British colonial engineers, the Scottish dairy farmers, the European shipping magnates, the French missionaries, and the highly skilled local Chinese printing workforce. All of these worlds are colliding in this one tiny district over decades.
Right.
And that kind of intense, localized friction eventually creates a vacuum for a brand new social identity to emerge.
Because you can't have that much cross-cultural infrastructure without a middleman. Which
Yeah.
brings us to the rise of the Chinese Christian elite.
Exactly. By the late 19th century, a distinct hybrid class had formed in Hong Kong. And at the center of this were the compradors.
The Pompadours, yeah.
These are the essential cultural and economic bridges. A comprador was a local Chinese manager who brokered trade between the massive Western firms and the vast, complex mainland Chinese market.
Because, I mean, a British shipping magnate might have the capital, but he doesn't speak the language, he doesn't understand the local clan structures, and he certainly doesn't have the trust of the inland merchants.
Precisely.
The comprador holds the actual keys to the market.
They did. And because of that, they became incredibly wealthy and influential. They were often Western educated, they understood international banking, and many were Christian, yet they remained fundamentally and culturally Chinese.
So they're walking in both worlds.
Yes. They existed in the liminal space between the British colonial rulers and the traditional local population. But a new, wealthy class always faces a problem. How do you legitimize your identity?
Right.
How do you permanently claim space in a transient colonial city where land is constantly changing hands?
Well, you do it through death. You buy a permanent plot of earth. Which brings us to 1882 and the establishment of the Pok Fu Lam Road Cemetery.
This cemetery is the geographical anchor for this new elite. As the research notes, it functions as a vertical map of society. When you study the graves, you aren't just looking at families. You are looking at the foundational titans of modern Hong Kong.
We're talking about the men who built the first modern commercial empires in the region, right? Like the founders of the massive Sincere and Wing-On department stores, the Kwok family, Ma Ying-pi. But it wasn't just corporate wealth either. It was intellectual wealth, too.
Yes. For example, you will find the grave of Reverend Feng Shi. He wasn't a CEO, he was a revolutionary thinker and the actual Chinese teacher of Sun Yat-sen.
Sun Yat-sen, the man who would eventually overthrow the Qing dynasty.
Yes, that's Sun Yat-sen.
So what does this all mean? It sounds like this cemetery was basically the physical LinkedIn network of 19th century Hong Kong.
That's a really good way to put it.
If you read the epitaphs, you can map out exactly who was connected to whom in early NGOs, businesses, and even revolutions.
And that highlights a crucial dynamic of the era. The British colonial police kept a very close eye on traditional Chinese gathering spaces to prevent uprisings.
Of course.
But they largely ignored the Christian churches and their associated networks. They just viewed them as Western-aligned and safe.
Ah, blind spot.
A huge one. So these church networks, heavily populated by the comprador elite, quietly functioned as secure, hidden channels for revolutionary ideas and funding to flow without raising colonial suspicion.
That is brilliant. The ultimate blind spot. And the physical layout of the cemetery tells this story of hierarchy and power perfectly.
You really got it.
If you visit today, you'll see it's built directly into the side of a steep mountain. The graves are arranged in escalating terraces. It's a literal three-dimensional representation of social stratification.
Yep.
The higher up the hill you go, the closer you are to the heavens and the more power you held.
You also have to look at the aesthetic evolution of the tombstones. If you locate the oldest, wealthiest graves from the 1880s, you will see they are decorated with these incredibly intricate, beautifully colored Peranakan-style tiles imported from Southeast Asia.
Oh, wow.
It was a flex of their regional trade wealth. But as you walk forward in time, traversing the newer sections of the cemetery, you watch those ornate hybrid designs slowly give way to very minimalist, heavy, almost corporate granite slabs.
Wow. So you are literally watching a culture solidify its identity in stone. It's fascinating. And there's one more layer to those oldest 1882 graves that I think ties this whole district's history together perfectly. They weren't originally dug in Pok Fu Lam.
That's right. Many of the oldest remains were actually relocated there from the Taiping Mountain area.
And why were they relocated? Because of the bubonic plague and urban displacement.
Yes, the government was clearing out crowded, plague-stricken neighborhoods to make way for new development.
So even in death, the population is being pushed and shuffled by the forces of disease and real estate. So when we take a step back and look at the totality of these sources, the narrative of Pok Fu Lam is stunning.
It is a masterclass in how physical spaces absorb human history. Pok Fu Lam began as a desperate survival frontier, utilizing Victorian engineering and Scottish cows to provide water and safe milk to a colony on the brink of collapse.
Yeah.
It then transformed into a vital node within a massive global network, managing shipping routes to London and printing texts for Vietnam. And ultimately, it served as the permanent canvas where power shifted away from the colonizers, allowing a newly formed, highly influential local elite to carve their legacy into the hillside. It is a historical text woven from water, milk, text, faith, and bones.
Which brings us back to you. The next time you are walking through your own neighborhood, past an unremarkable reservoir or an old university dorm or a cemetery on a hill, remember that the pavement is just a facade.
It always is.
Look at the infrastructure. Pay attention to the weird window frames or the strange angles of a building. There are incredible, invisible networks of survival, wealth, and revolution hiding right beneath your feet, just waiting for someone to notice.
The landscape never forgets. We just stop reading it.
Exactly. Which leaves me with one final thought for you to chew on today. Considering how rapidly we pave over, demolish, and repurpose our own cities, if archaeologists were to dig up our completely ordinary, mundane residential suburbs 150 years from now, what bizarre spatial transitions or hidden global networks would our infrastructure reveal about what we valued most?
Now, that is an important question about our own legacy.
Until next time, keep looking beneath the pavement.